initiative of Students' Union SRCC. She was a summer associate at DSP BlackRock Mutual Fund, after which she got placed as a business analyst at McKinsey and Company. Currently, she is working as an investment analyst at Westbridge Capital. Jayashree was the president of Cognizant's SRCC. She interned at JSW, Ogilvy and Mather. She got a placement offer from Boston Consulting Group in 2018 as an associate and is currently a senior associate. Shravya was a team member at Enactus SRCC and an event head at the SRCC Business Conclave. She was a mentor at the Consulting Club SRCC. She was a trainee at Yes Bank and interned at Aditya Birla Sun Life Asset Management. She got a placement offer for the position of associate consultant at LEK Consulting and is currently working as an associate at Apax Partners LLP. Ankita was the director of research at Enactus SRCC. She was a research intern at Center for Policy Research and the founder of Farm to Fork, a farmer enterprise that sets up markets in residential complexes. She was placed as a business analyst at McKinsey and Company and is currently an engagement and innovation lead at Rocket Learning, a not-for-profit startup. We would like to thank all the 4 panelists for taking out time from their busy schedule and joining us today. To begin with this job shadowing session, let's talk about the what and why of consulting. What is consulting and what skills does consulting teach a person? Why did you decide to become a consultant? Please.
Do we follow an order or any of us can start?
Any of you can start. It's a discussion.
Do you guys want to start or I can?
No, Jayashree, please go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, firstly, hi everyone. Feels so good to be called back here. We also feel super old. I think I speak for all of us when I say this. But it's always a great feeling to come back, even virtually, to SRCC. We wanted to start with what exactly is consulting, right? Shashwat? So this is actually a very hard answer. I don't think my parents still know what exactly I do, because you do a multitude of things and every day it's something different. But broadly, to put things in perspective, consulting is basically trying to ensure that you deliver value to your clients. It may be in the form of increased profitability. It may be in the form of a market entry strategy. It may be post-merger integration, anything around that. So simply put, it's just about ensuring that your client gets what they pay for. And this can be across industries, across functions, like I just mentioned. So, Anki, are you sharing your screen? You guys understand what I said?
Yeah. So should I add on a bit? Can you hear me?
Yeah, Ankita.
Okay, cool. So just adding on to what Jayashree said, the broad mandate is delivering value to the client. I think that there are a few buckets or types of projects, that I think we tend to typically do. There's strategy. Then that's basically what Jayashree was talking about, right? Like market entry, profitability, cost cutting, which tends to be lesser. Mostly tends to be growth related problems that we try to solve, or just digitalization of a company. Like let's say a bank wants to go digital, right? Like there are lots of projects around creating a roadmap for them. So those are examples of, say, strategy projects where the first part would be strategy, where you're defining exactly what the client needs to do and how they need to go about it. The second type would be operations, which is what consulting is becoming about now. So a lot of clients now, they don't want you to just make a strategy, they want you to implement it for them, because that's where the real value is. So some projects are strategy, some are strategy plus operations. Then the third type would be implementation, which is more like moving the needle on the ground. So let's say you have production houses, or you have it could be anything from mining to oil and gas to steel factories to anything, like any industry, but you're talking about production. So maybe actually moving a metric, like moving their output from X to Y, and moving it on a day to day or a month to month basis. So actually working with the ground level teams. So I would say these are the three broad types of projects we work on. And then there are at various levels. So it's both with, like, the top level clients, as well as working teams who work on the ground, like middle level managers and frontline workers. um and the last kind would just be some sort of a miscellaneous bucket, which would involve things like really interesting things like reports that you could work on. For example, McKinsey has MGI, and I think the other firms have equivalent arms where you do research reports, and you spend 2 to 3 months doing that for within the firm. And the last kind within the miscellaneous would be client development, where you're helping partners or associate partners develop pitches for clients, which again involves different types of research. So I think these would be the broad types of projects that people do at consulting, which is what we figured out like 2 years into consulting, not before that. So that might be helpful.
And maybe I'll just add
Is there
one more thing,
anything else
Ankita.
that you guys want to add?
Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
one more thing which might be like a bit of strategy, but let's say due diligences, right? That we do.
Correct.
So most of these private equity and investing firms who basically want to evaluate a particular company, whether or not to put their money or their dollars into a particular company, they would essentially come to a consulting firm for a due diligence project, which is essentially asking a consulting firm, let's say for example a McKinsey or BCG or an LEK, to tell and evaluate the market prospects of that particular company, how strong is the brand of that company. And usually these due diligence are shorter term projects, like about a month or so, but super hectic. So at McKinsey or maybe equally at BCG and LEK, whenever you get staffed on a duty, you are essentially, your life goes for a toss basically, because working on weekends. So these are the hardest projects, but the shortest. So I think that would
Yeah.
be the last addition. But yeah,
Just
Shravya, if there's anything.
just to add to what Sanchi said, like there are various kinds of due diligence. Consulting firms usually do commercial diligence. Like there are various kinds. There could be legal diligence, there could be vendor, financial, etc. But consulting firms, when they're engaged by a private equity firm, we usually call it commercial diligence. And when they're engaged by the sell side, which is basically anyone who wants to sell their asset, it's usually called vendor diligence. So you do both sorts of diligences in a consulting sort of environment.
Right. Yeah. That was your first question, Shashwat. I think, was there anything else that we didn't cover?
What skills does consulting teach a person?
Teach. Okay.
Yeah.
I would go first for this question. So I think there are two things that I think I took away from McKinsey. One is definitely communication, and how structured can a person be, and how crisp can a person be when they are trying to convey something. So definitely communication. And the second is relationship management, which is more to do with, because every day you're engaging with clients and you have to work with clients. You have to co-create solution with clients, otherwise they would probably not listen to you if you just appear as an external consultant in front of them. So those would be like the top two takeaways for me from consulting, which really adds to your soft skills bucket. But yeah, over to Jayashree, Ankita, Shravya to add.
I think to this, like communication is obviously very important, and Sanchi has covered it. What I would add to this is basically a little more structured approach to thinking and not just communication, which is basically if you're given any problem. Now, you are very new to that industry more often than not. You don't know the ins and outs of the industry. But what you do want to do is if you want to break down a problem into a way that you can approach it in the most efficient manner. So it's basically like however you break down a problem, it could be like which market should we enter, right? And sometimes I remember I doing one project where the client was like, we want to open something across the world. Can you tell us which are the markets? Now you have 170 odd countries. How do you filter that down? So the structure was deciding, or the answer to that question was deciding what is the right metric. How do you think about this problem, and how do you break it down into easily solvable or actionable work streams? Because you can say a lot in theory, but what is it that you can really actually do? So a structured approach to thinking, which we, in case consulting prep also we called it like MECE approach, which is mutually exclusive and cumulatively exhaustive. So I think that would be my biggest takeaway from a consulting point of view.
Adding on to this, this actually is turning out to be, I'm sure even the others might think this, but this is how we get our evaluations also after a case. So these are the broad buckets of that. The only thing missing from this, from an eval point of view at least, is it also teaches you resourcefulness or practicality. When it comes down to mostly implementation cases, it's you need to get the job done. There are multiple things that can come in your way, and you need to be resourceful enough, effective enough to ensure that you stick to your timelines. You also think through when you can do what, and this doesn't just help in terms of work, but also personally, right? So I think that's the only thing I would add. Anything else you guys want to add?
Actually, just to add to that, what Jayashree said, I think I would just add the fact that it helps you become convincing enough in front of people. Because when Jayashree mentioned that you need to get that job done, essentially, we as consultants will never go and, so I was on a steel project, right? I will never go and make steel the way I want to, but I will have to convince a person to go and make steel the way I want him to do it. So, you just learn that art of tactfully teaching a person what they already know for 20 years, what they already know by being in that industry. So you have to come across as a very convincing, reasonable, data backed person.
That actually reminds me of another thing. It teaches you to be very, very adaptive. If we were to talk about a new industry coming up right now, the first set of resources that the industry will think of hiring are consultants, because we're the ones that 1 week into the case are expected to know a good level of information on what the industry is and how it works. Even when we had the entire e-commerce boom, and whenever a new industry comes up, you will see that the founders, or at least the core team, or the people that are recruited immediately, are mostly consultants, because we're the ones that that can adapt to new things.
Okay. So I'll just add on. I think I just have one thing to add on, right? Apart from all of this, I think it's adjacent to structured approach to thinking, but problem solving is basically what consultants uh, tend to pick up. All of this, just to synthesize, all of this ties into problem solving, being able to solve a problem efficiently. Like that involves communication, because you need to communicate with your clients to reach a consensus. That needs relationship building, again, for the same reason. You have a structured approach. I think one thing to add here would be a data backed approach. A lot of times you need to be able to structure a problem and then use a lot of data to, I mean, in most cases at least, use data to back up different hypotheses, right? So you get a lot of data down. This is one part of the job, right? Figuring out what data you need, because there's always a lot of data available in the world. So figuring out what data you need and how you cut across that data to figure out the answer that your client and your team is looking for, because 100 variables are not going to be useful to anybody. So it's up to you to figure out which 5 variables are the most important and get to those. So yeah, problem solving, I think. And I think all of these skills, what they essentially do is that they are transferable. And so at the end of whatever stage you are, maybe 2 years or 4 years of consulting, these skills transfer out into different jobs and industries. So all of these skills that you pick up, like let's say you just want to, we'll get to all of the comprehensive exit options, but the point is that let's say that you just need to have like lead or join a new project at another job in a specific industry. Ideally you would be able to use all of these skills, and you would ideally be the best person to figure out how to say start a new project or do something new within another company. So yeah, just all of these skills are very transferable.
Yeah.
In addition to
That
that.
reminds me of something. So this is very, very tactical point, but it really teaches you PPT and Excel. Because that's something that, for example, when I was interviewing, let's say for a different exit option that we'll come to later, but the first thing that they can be assured of is that if you're a consultant, you really know how to make pages, how to best communicate your message using PPT, and how to best do your data analysis using Excel. That's a basic assumption. And it does teach you, consulting does, they does teach you Excel and PPT modeling, etc. I mean, all of these skills. So yeah.
Does anybody want to does anyone have questions? Because I think all of four of us have spoken quite a bit and we've answered these two questions, but is there anything more relevant or specific that we can answer? You can ask or type it in chat, I guess.
We will have a Q&A round at the end of this session.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah. So structured thinking, art of convincing, and data crunching is something which can be used in day-to-day lives as well, and consulting teaches this to a person. So let's talk about a typical day in the life of a consultant and the mindset required for the same.
Okay, I can start. So again, your day completely depends on what kind of case slash study slash what kind of project you're on. So and it has also changed a lot post COVID. So if I were to talk about pre-COVID, your week typically starts with a Monday morning flight, where you go directly to the client site, work on whatever it is that you're working, and then you fly back on Thursday or Fridays. But now it's almost completely remote. So you wake up just in time for your 9 a.m. catch up in the morning, and that's how it works. But it mostly is around what we listed out before, right? You own your particular module. So how a case works is that there is a manager, and then you have multiple resources under them, associates or consultants or whatever they call it, and all of them own a particular piece of the module that you work on along with your manager. And whatever it is that module requires you to do, you own that end to end. So it can be so a typical day could include things like Excel analysis, meetings with clients, creating decks. Sorry.
Expert calls.
Expert calls, definitely. Yeah, that's about it, is what I would say. I mean, if you're on a different kind of case, again, pre-COVID, and if you're on, let's say, a sales or a GTM piece, then you will be on the ground. You will be traveling to multiple places. This was actually my very first case in BCG, where I was doing something related to sales. So I was doing like 150 kilometers on the road every day, traveling across Gujarat, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, etc. So yeah, I mean, completely depends on what kind of case you're on, and you can never say this is a typical day of a consultant. But broadly, these are the elements.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I think I hear some echo. Can everyone else also hear it?
We can hear you clearly.
Okay, great. So it varies slightly for LEK, I would say, because LEK does not have a lot of client-facing work. By client-facing, I mean we don't really fly to client locations, and the reason for that is that, let's say, the bread and butter for LEK, at least for due diligences, which means you're working mostly for private equity clients, and when you're working for private equity clients, you won't really need to fly to their place to sit out of there and work. So, but our travel did involve, depending on the geography that we were working on, our travel did involve to different geographies to sort of get a feel of the market and do expert calls and all sorts of other things. But like Jayashree said, like there's you will be given one work stream, and the ownership depends on your level. So there's a manager who's responsible for the overall case delivery. Then there is a consultant below it, and then there's an associate below it who will be responsible for one work stream. Now, for example, if there's a project on, say, anything, like for example, if there's a due diligence, then there are probably 3 or 4 work streams. One is doing the market, one is doing competitive landscape. One is doing asset, asset forecast and revenue model, etc. So you will be given one work stream, and depending on what your work stream is, you will be required to do uh, the actions that you need to do in that particular work stream. But overall, all of this, like really, what we do is PPT and Excel. I would say, like Sanchi also mentioned earlier, but that's what your day job would look like. But what you would do on that PPT or Excel would vary on the work stream that you're working for.
Day and night job, basically. So, yeah, yeah. I just, yeah, I think I just add on. I think, yeah, broadly. So there's Excel, PPT, lots of due diligence at LEK, and ownership. I think, yeah, in terms of mindset, yeah, I think you gotta kind of be ready for all of this stuff. And I think what ownership entails is uh, a lot of commitment and zeal to the problem you're solving, because that often ends up being even in terms of time. So, like consultants work at least, I would say, 13 to up to 13 to maybe 14, 15 hours a day, but like at least minimum 12. So like the mindset definitely involves being ready to work really hard throughout, basically. And maybe there are lots of perks and stuff, but yeah, it's a lot of hard work also, I would say. Just to be super realistic about it, right? Because yeah, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah,
Good.
but we should also add like the fun parts of, of consulting in addition
Yeah,
to
yeah, the luxury mindset. I don't know if it exists in COVID though.
yeah, it doesn't really exist in COVID. It's quite boring right now. But at least pre-COVID, we also have a lot of fun things. You know, you take some breaks in between. You go out for dinner. You have a lot of parties. You have a lot of these catch-ups. You know, within your cohort, with the whole firm, and your team. You have like these team outings. So multiple things because they do make you work a lot. So you need to be also rewarded in some ways.
Yeah, and I would just add one more thing. I don't know, is can you guys hear me clearly? I can hear an echo again. Okay,
We can
perfect. So
hear you.
I was just saying, you need to have a very feedback oriented mindset. Is one, like people will just give you feedback on everything that you do. So for the first at least 2, 3, 4 years of your life in consulting, you need to keep improving. And usually that doesn't happen in a lot of jobs as much as it happens in consulting. There will be like a 3 month or depending on your manager, 3 month cycle of feedback apart from annual feedbacks, right? So you'll be judged on a lot of things, evaluated on a lot of parameters, but you need to take them positively and improve. You're expected to do that, rather than you might not agree with everything, but you are expected to take that feedback and improve on it. So yeah, I think that's one point that I would add.
The
Uh,
reward.
Sorry, Ankita, I just saw your notes. I think the LEK difference that you wrote in point number 5, it's not like we don't travel or the travel is just not on a Monday to Friday basis. It depends on where you're going. So, for example, I was in the Middle East for about 6 months of my life cumulatively uh, during my 2.5 years there. So it's basically not a Monday to Friday travel, which is I think
Got
much more hectic. But
Yeah.
yeah,
got it. Yeah, 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 yeah. Sorry, thanks for calling that out.
no
Okay.
problem.
So
Yeah,
the
Shashwat, please go on.
yeah, so the rewards and fun are clubbed together with the diligent work. Let's see what we as college students can do. What did you do at SRCC which helped you become a consultant?
I think I'd like to start off on this one before people can just get into specifics. I think what I realized, the broad, obviously nobody knows the selection criteria, right? It's crazy. And yeah, it's like there's no defined selection criteria that everyone can know of. But I think the crux of what, at least I think that McKinsey or any of our firms actually look at in a CV is high ownership and dedication to execute something. So I think those are two things that they look for in somebody's CV, that somebody has made the effort to either start something or lead something. So like ownership plus ownership to lead something, and actually put in all of the efforts and take that end to end, drive that initiative or club or whatever it is end to end. So I think that that's sort of the crux of what they look for. Yeah, ownership, leadership, initiative.
Yeah, just to add on to it, I mean, if you start from, the basics of what, from a very CV oriented mindset, right? What Ankita said is 100% right. If you think about it at a larger picture, on a more micro detailed basis, if I would have to like pick 4 5 things which are important, one is definitely your college grades. Don't ignore that. Most of the consulting firms would have a cutoff in their mind, and that would depend on your batch average. But please ensure that you're there in at least the top 10% if possible, right? That's one thing that every consulting firm, or in fact a lot of firms that will come to college, will look at. The second thing, when it comes to extracurriculars, definitely ownership, leadership, and I would maybe add an impact lens to it. Please quantify everything that you've done. Do things that are quantifiable, so that you can talk about those things, talk about how you've made an impact in X number of lives. So there are certain colleges and clubs and societies that give you that opportunity, but there are a lot of other colleges, societies that that can help you write that, define that impact in a very different manner as well. So wherever you are, try and create some kind of difference in that particular club slash society. And I would say, in terms of, I think that's it. And in terms of ownership, impact, entrepreneurship, leadership, those are the things that people look at. And your internship, right? So, in case you get a college internship, like on campus internship, that's usually more, like more favored than something that you've gotten outside of college. But even if you do outside of college internship, make sure it's with a good brand. Because see, I mean, honestly speaking, a lot of things are defined by the brands that you're associated with, rather than the substance, I would say, at this level. So I mean, this is a big, just being a little hardcore here, but ensure that you do a good internship, ensure that you're there in at least one of the good colleges and recognized colleges of the society, and ensure that you have good grades. I mean, those are the things that worked for me. But yeah, Jayashree, Shravya, um, on to you to add.
Yeah, I think just to give you a little bit of lens, having done recruiting for 2 years, so like if you look DU as a whole, we used to get like a daily about 500 odd applications, and hiring targets, or I would not say hiring targets, but we'd end up hiring less than five, so that's 1%. And to hire that 1%, you'd interview say about 30, and I'm making these numbers up, but ballpark would be the same, which is I would say like 5 odd % of people that you were filtering out of those 500 applications. Now, if you get all these applications, the first filter that anyone would apply is some basic mark cutoff, like both Ankita and Sanchie mentioned. And that varies upon the college, that varies upon course, etc., etc. But there is a basic cutoff. Now, that would get like, say, about that 500 applications down to about 200, 300, depending on whatever that cutoff is. Now, if you have to sort out those 200 applications again to get to those 30, what do you do? So, some of the things that you would look at is internships. What are the quality of those internships, whether it's like, very highly known internship, like which are very hard to get, could be like campus internships. And did you end up getting a PPO or not? So things like that. And but basically, what you would look at, two odd spikes, as we would call it, like spikes is just like a buzzword, but what it really means is that you don't have to be like the master of all, jack of all trades, but if you did exceptionally well in a couple of things, that's great, because you took ownership and you led that, and you sort of like were able to prove that whatever you did extremely well. Now you could be like a great, for example, I'm just giving like random examples, but you could be like a great in academics, and then you could be great in some extracurricular. Maybe you had like an international level tennis competition, etc., and you won it, or national levels, etc. But maybe you had like okay internships and okay POR. So that also works. But what people look of it is like a couple of things which you took and you really took it to the end, and you really let that. So I would say those are the spikes that people look for. And it doesn't really have to be like a defined formula that, if you do X internships, then you are more likely to get it. But it's basically a whole profile which is speaking to you. And whatever you do, I think in college you should just do it with a lot of like you should just make impact in whatever role you take, and that could be an internship, which again is quantifiable by the way of a PPO. It could be a society, which is quantifiable by the way of your position in that society. If you did well in a society, you're likely to be president or co-president or etc., like directors, etc. And if you did very well in some extracurriculars, you can quantify that by the amount of competitions that you have won. So that I would like just to put a little bit of perspective on how people look at CVs. Yeah, that would be my take.
I think these guys covered more or less all of it. The only thing I would add in terms of tactically is to make sure that you might have done a lot of stuff, but you also need to write it in a very impactful way. So make sure you take the help of your seniors, your immediate seniors, or placement cell. Ensure that you write out your CV well, because some of the like sometimes the CVs that we receive are really poorly made as well. So make sure that it looks good. You use the right kind of impactful words, and definitely go through multiple rounds of iterations with your seniors.
Yeah. So like what Jayashree was like, actually what everyone said also, like quantifiable actionable statements are, I think, just from a CV perspective, super important, right? Like led the initiative that impacted XX people, or I don't know, like worked on a project with this company that involved interviewing like 100+ employees or something like that. If you did something like that at an internship, just basically, yeah, quantifying would yeah just quantifying and actionable statements like led or initiated or worked on, like that should be how, very tactically, super tactical point, but that should be how ideally all the sentences of your CV begin, because that's better than a paragraph. Like 5 points on exact things that you did are more impactful than a paragraph that's describing different things. That's just super tactical point that might be helpful. um I guess I just wanted to add one thing that yeah, to what Sanchi was saying about internships. I think yeah, brand is also important, but sometimes I think that if you have several spikes on your CV and your internship is a good brand, but maybe it's not a corporate internship, like just for people who maybe have done an internship with a think tank or something like my. So in Enactus, we don't do an internship in the first year, but because we're leading or participating in several projects, that becomes okay. So it's totally okay to not do an internship for people who are in Enactus, at least for the first year. That because I did Enactus, so I can speak to that. And in the second year, I did an internship with a think tank called the Center for Policy Research. So it's a super renowned think tank based out of Delhi, and it fit in with my story. So because it fit in with my story, it worked out. So even though I hadn't done a college specific internship because that wasn't my particular interest area at the time, it was okay for me because maybe my CV had another spike and it fit into that story. So yeah, this is just a call out for people who might want to do slightly different things as well. Yeah.
I think just a couple of more points on how you can quantify impact is, for example, if you're doing an event, like for example, I did Market Mania, so the amount of like applications that we got through, which are the amount of people that we reached out to, or the applications, etc., was like a quantifiable impact that we could show. At the same time, I feel like sometimes people go a little overboard when they're trying to quantify impact, and like we've seen CVs, but recruiters can really see right through it because I would say like your CVs are being looked at by people who've been at that college or who had experience of going through multiple CVs or hundreds and thousands of CVs on an everyday. It's not an HR department which shows more often than not shortlisting a CV. It's basically the associate. And correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's mostly associates, and they've either worked in they've been part of your college, or they have like guidance from people from the college as to what's like practical and what's not. So don't like, I think don't write something that you didn't really do. I think recruiters can see through it.
Hmm.
We will definitely make a
Even
note of.
I
Yeah, please.
Okay. Even I thought of another point that I think, just to make this more like clear, right? So whatever all of the stuff that we've been saying from an SRCC point of view, that would boil down to a few things. Being having a leadership role at a good society in college, right? That's important. Like a role that gives you a lot of responsibility, that gives you a lot of opportunity to lead initiatives end to end. That kind of a role. So taking up a role or one or two or more roles in college, that's the first thing. I think the second thing that a lot of us did was, at least several of us did case study competitions, right? Like that was like a big part of some of our CVs. So doing the really good ones like Dream Merger that Stephens hosts, I don't know which year everybody here is in, and if all of those are over or what, but like doing things like Dream Merger or taking part in the Shri case competition, just doing a lot of like case competitions was something that people did. So case competitions, responsibility oriented roles like directors or presidents or leads of something at a high responsibility society in college, and getting a college internship or another powerful internship that fits into your story, right? Those are the three quantifiable things. The fourth one is really good grades. So if like if your CGPA, like I don't know when your exams are coming up, but I guess this is one of, if you're in the second year, this is like the last semester, right? Which the grades that count for next year. So just very actionably, like work really hard, like put everything aside and get your CGPA up as far as you can. So I think those would be the four like very actionable things that everybody can work on.
We will make a note of these and try to mold our college experience on these lines. Could you please give us tips from your experiences on cracking case interviews?
Oh, no.
This question would go on for like really long.
Yeah.
Maybe we can structure it and then deep dive into a few things. Like, how do we structure this prep?
Um,
Maybe we can talk about it from the perspective of the personal interview and the
and
case
this, yeah, even I was
interview,
thinking.
right? So maybe like two of us can take, otherwise it'll go on forever and ever. Or
Sure.
let's start
Yeah.
with one of those buckets.
Sure. So I think Ankita, as she mentioned, right? So there are two buckets for any of these interviews across firms. One is the personal interview experience, which is essentially to do with the HR questions, and the second is to do with your technical round, which is your case study, right? I would probably touch upon case study, and then maybe in the end I can add on the personal experience. So case study, when I was prepping for it, I think the key was to do it in groups. There's no point reading cases. So there are case books available, no matter how many case books you go through, right? But just for everyone's benefit, the top three case books would be Case in Point, and I think there was Case Interviews Cracked. I think those were the two that I referred to, but there are a lot more. There is I Am Ahmedabad case book. There is Wharton. I mean, there are like thousands of books that you can refer to. But what really helps you in the end is how many cases you solved with people and not read through. Right? There's no point reading through. So typically these interviews would have two kinds of cases. One would be like a problem solving on profitability, and the second would be more towards guesstimates, right? So which are basically estimating something. Now these estimates are simpler to kind of do right now. I mean, that's what I was always more inclined towards a guesstimate question than a case question. A case could go anywhere, but guesstimates is what essentially what you're supposed to do is they would, for example, give you estimate the revenue of Delhi Metro in a day, for example, right? Now all you have to do is understand the approach, whether it's a how it worked for me was whether it's a demand side problem or a supply side problem. I'm going into a little detailed on guesstimates and cases here. But see, demand side problem or a supply side problem, once you've figured that out, then approach more or less remains similar. Essentially, what the recruiter is looking at is not the final number. So whether you arrive at 100 crore number or a 500 crore number, unless you are very off, they would not really I mean, they would not even look at the final number. But what they're essentially looking for is the approach that you follow. How do you break down the revenue, and how do you come to an answer which is reasonably correct? Also, in the end, it's always better to triangulate that number using any other approach if possible, right? So that's on the guesstimate bit. how I prepped for guesstimate was, I don't know if any one of you referred to it, but mostly I did YouTube videos, and I found that super helpful because there was no particular book with a lot of guesstimate questions or a lot of guesstimate approaches. So I went through a lot of YouTube videos just randomly trying to understand what are the questions. And I think the consulting club for that year had also shared a list of guesstimates, like a probable potential guesstimate, and that is super helpful. If you can do that, I think there are about 30-35 questions. If you can do that, then you should be through. Then you shouldn't worry about any other question unless that recruiter is having fun with you. So I think that's on the guesstimates part. On the case study part, mostly they'll ask you two types of question. One is the profitability, and the other is market entry doesn't come very often, if I remember correctly. I think one was profitability, and M&A also doesn't come very frequently. Which one was the second one, Jayashree?
I think
Ankita?
the second one was market entry, right?
Market entry was the second one, is it? There were three types, right? Market entry, profitability,
Pricing.
pricing. So
Pricing.
pricing and M&A, they don't appear in at this level. Market entry and profitability are the top two types of cases that come in any of your interviews. Profitability is usually simple, right? Revenue minus cost, and then you go to like components of revenue, you dig deeper into each of these, and then costs are separate. And market entry is a bit tricky, so you'll again have to guesstimate it and then understand the typicality of each market. But how I prepped for it were case books, people giving me feedback because I used to do cases with them. And I usually tried to do cases with different types of people. So what essentially happens is if you just stick to one group and keep doing cases with them, then the approach of like both of your approaches would just become similar at one point, and you won't be really like giving feedback to each other, but just validation. So it's better to always switch groups after you're comfortable with particular group, to just get different perspective on how people can think about it. So usually that was my approach for case interview questions. Yeah, I would just let people, Jayashree, Ankita, Shravya add on that, and maybe then we can cover PEI later. Yeah.
I can add on to the technical interview part. I think I remember the very first thing that I went through was some of these Victor Chen videos. They're very basic, but they help you just think of broadly what the components are. So maybe you can start with that. And then I would say start with guesstimates and then get to cases, because guesstimates also help you put things in a structure which you will again need for a case. And I think also very tactically, we had Bain coming in first, which only had guesstimates. So all of us naturally ended up doing only guesstimates first, and then we moved on to cases. But also in terms of time, you should definitely try and make it a habit to do at least one case every day. And I think all of us prep for at least, I mean, you get a shortlist at least a month before, right? So you prep for at least like a good 20 days before the interviews. And the books, I guess, are more or less similar. The only thing I would add is that while they say that, these are the most typical ones that you will get, there is also a very slight chance that you will get some kind of blue sky thinking case, M&A. I personally got an M&A case in my last round in BCG. So there is also a very small chance that that also might happen. So while you shouldn't spend all of your time on it, you should just know what it's about. Very, very upper say. I think that's about it in terms of technical interviews. I have nothing else to add on.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add on the technical aspect is that like there is no right quantity of cases that would prepare you for the interview. What I would do is also go back to my previous cases, and when I would take feedback from people, try to implement it and see where I went wrong and where I could have went or could have done better. So it's a little more tactical in terms of like that. Usually there's a question of, how many cases that you should do before you sit for an interview. I think there's no right answer to that. If you think you're getting the hang of being able to structure things, and that happens in both guesstimates and both in case studies as well. If you can structure things well, then you can almost sort of crack any case, whether it's market entry or it's profitability or any other blue sky case. But so I would like to note down what errors I made in a case and sort of had like an error logbook of sorts. On the PI aspect, I think what I would add is it's a good way to drive the conversation in a way. And this usually, I would say like about 60 or 70% of your time would be case interview, and the rest 30 would probably be a PI. And it becomes increasingly important as you go up. So like in a partner round, your case interview will not be important, or he may even not even ask you a case interview. It depends. Like if you've already passed certain technical levels and certain bars, then the PI, the personal aspect becomes a lot more important. And what people usually test is it's also a good way. For example, if you're opening with, introduce yourself, and you want to bring out certain aspects of your own personality, and you can drive that into the conversation as a follow-up question. So for example, you can say that you want to, for example, if you would are very interested in tennis, so you can just say that you were like really fond of tennis, etc., and this is what you've done in tennis. Then naturally a follow-up question would follow. Like, so it's a good way to drive a conversation. So see parts of your CV, parts of your aspect and personality, which you want to bring forth to the interviewer and to the partner or anyone, so that you can drive, also control the conversation and drive a conversation in a certain way.
That actually reminds me. The types of cases that you get also, the kind of profile that you have also significantly impacts that. So let's say you've interned in a particular space, or you worked on a particular thing, that there's a high chance that they might give you a case in that itself. So even for me, when I had interned at Ogilvy, one of my clients was Vodafone. So the case that I got was saying that, okay, let's imagine that Vodafone is your client, and they want to do something, and whatever, it goes from there. But that's also like a natural flow in terms of, so go through your CV, look at those industries, identify those industries where you think they can potentially make up a case around.
Yeah, and just one thing to add on the technical aspect, do like avoid making errors on math, because usually you're being kind of evaluated on that. Especially the most common mistakes are zeros. You'll either miss a zero, or you'll add an additional zero, something like that. Usually that's the mistake that I also used to make. So what helped me there was just to just to write it in exponents. So like if it is million or crores, just make it 10 to the power 6 or 10 to the power 7, and when you're dividing, etc., then my probability of making an error reduced, just because I used to write these big numbers in like exponents rather than writing like 6 zeros for a million, right? So avoid math mistakes and get comfortable with solving maths quickly. They also will give you a quant heavy case in one of your rounds at least, if not in all. Basically they're trying to check your quantitative skills there. So yeah, I
You
think
can
that's
just,
just
and like follow, adding on to that, you can just keep like rounding up, rounding down. I mean, they just want to know how good your math is. You don't need, like, if the number is 4,687, you can just make it, mostly you can make it, like 4,000, if it's 4,687, you can make it 4,700 or 5,000, like if it's that round offable, just round it off, and things like
yeah,
that.
don't make it
Really simple thing.
complicated for yourself. Just don't be like,
Yeah.
for example, like there was one technique of, there are 1200, let's say if you have to 120 crores population, right? So just don't, just remove 20 crores and just be like, okay, poverty line wale log hain, I'll remove 20 crores and I'll work with 100. So whatever those numbers, if you could quickly round them to like nearest tens, nearest hundreds, it just makes your life easier, and doesn't matter for the recruiter, doesn't matter for the interviewer, right? If you're doing that, so just ensure that you are sensible in, just rounding off, but quickly round things up.
Hmm.
Another tactical tip actually is in terms of just writing down the things, as you solve the case. Because more or less, your interviewers are listening to you, but also looking at what you're writing down and how you're structuring it out. So, I mean, try to make sure that you're not too messy. What you're writing down makes sense. Involve the interviewer in your approach. The way you tell your story and the way you write it out. Just ensure that they're also in it.
Yeah, you should appear very coachable there.
Yeah.
Don't be hell-bent on an approach that, like this is the right approach. I won't even take your feedback, won't listen
Yeah.
to you if you're talking about changing an approach. If the interviewer is hinting that, if is there a better way to think about it, think about it. Because he wants you to, he wants you to basically just push you to more structured thinking or an approach that he thinks is better. So appear coachable when you're coming up with a structure for your case.
Yeah, yeah. So what you can do in an interview is ideally what I think every one of us does or did was when you get the case, you can say, I need a minute. You first structure your case because the whole point of the technical interview, as Shravya said, is to be able to structure things, right? That's your end goal. Because at least in my McKinsey interviews, there were very few cases that fit into any of these buckets of profitability, market entry, etc. Mine were a lot of just because that's often they might just give you cases they are working on, and so they may not be these bucket holes, right, that you are learning in different case books. So the just think of it like this: the objective of the technical interview is to be able to structure anything and everything under the sun. You start off by practicing profitability, market entry, etc., because they don't intuitively come to us because we've not done those kinds of things for businesses before. So you start off learning those. But like for example, what me and another friend of mine did was that we just started structuring value chains, right? They weren't in any case books, but what we did was we figured that, okay, like, if we had to structure, okay, we just made up cases of our own that are really simple but involve a lot of structuring. Like if there's a delay in my Mintra parcel reaching me, what could be the issue, right? Because let's say that the company's problem statement is reducing the time it takes to make a parcel reach someone. There's a lot of structuring involved in that, because you need to be able to know what are all the possible ways from the time you place the order till it reaches you. What are the 5 6 different places or processes that occur in the middle or could occur where a breakdown could have happened. That's an example of a structuring that you would need to do that doesn't really fit into these any of these sort of categories. So the idea is that you need to be able to structure, so you need to be able to structure anything. So just I would recommend, highly recommend, taking out some time to just do blue sky thinking just for the sake of it, because that'll just improve your technique, and your cases might not be from case books, right? So don't mug up cases. That's not going to be helpful. Use them to learn how to structure. Like for example, like someone gave us this blue sky thinking uh case, like blue sky thinking, like a blue sky thinking question would be that a partner turned up late for a meeting, right? What could be the possible reasons? I think
I
Jayashree got
actually
this
got,
one.
yeah, yeah, I
Yeah,
actually
Jayashree
got
got
this
this one.
case. Yeah, I actually got my buddy from BCG had given me this case. It was one of the most interesting cases, and honestly, like, sorry, Ankita, I'm eating up into what you were
Yeah,
saying.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, most of the cases that you end up getting don't fall under these buckets. These are things that you use to, again, structure the way you think. I can give you all more examples of the places that I actually got in my BCG interviews also. I think one was just building on that Vodafone example. So he said, okay, so let's say our client is Vodafone. They want to move away from telecom. What should we suggest? That's all the case was. Like if they don't want to do calls or data, what else should they do? So that's like a completely open-ended case, right? And we do a lot of this. Like we do have multiple clients who come to us, multiple MNCs who have multiple businesses and they want to open a new business. Then where do you start and how do you go about that? So it's you don't really expect typical profitability or market entry questions because that won't really happen.
And something that would help you answer something like this would be if you're also aware of GK in general, like, so something I remember at least me and another friend did before these interviews, we made sure that we had gotten our reading habits in place, like just reading the Mint or reading the Hindu opinion pieces, like just having current affairs in place, because you can get questions like that. Like one of our friends, Aditi, she got a case on the steel industry, right, in India, something about steel dumping by China. So if you at least have basic awareness of steel in India, then you'll be able to incorporate that somewhere, right? And also, yeah, so she got, like, she was a badminton player, so she also got this case on a brand campaign for, like, would you choose PV Sindhu or someone else? I don't remember,
Yeah,
another
yeah.
badminton player. So just be really aware of current affairs, I would say, because you don't need to know anything specific. They don't need you to know anything specific about specific industries, but you need to know things like at what rate is the economy growing, or broadly what industries are doing well. Like you can't say something that might just be tanking in a COVID situation. So just be aware of general and current affairs. I think that's a really important element of being able to answer these questions sensibly.
And to add to Ankita's point, that's super important, especially if you have something like that on your CV. So, like for
Yeah.
example, in one of my interviews, I'd worked on Project ASBA, and there was a new Jal Shakti department ministry that was coming up. And I think there was a discussion, like he just started that discussion, not even asked, he didn't even ask me if I know about it, right? He just assumed that if I worked in a water project, I should be aware of it. So ensure that if there's anything, like read every word of your CV and think of a question that can be formed on that particular line. So that was something I did after I made my CV, that just to make sure that all my GK and current affairs are in line with what I've written, and I know something that I can talk about something. That's something very important that Ankita just mentioned. So yeah.
And I think there's also this other, there's one case book, I don't recall which one, but that had a very small 1 or 2 page brief on the most common industries. It always helps to have a very basic understanding of how a particular industry works. Is it capex dependent? Is it opex? What kind of revenue streams do they have? A very, very basic understanding of what these different things are, and the basics of the industry. I think one of the case books had that. Maybe I can check and let you guys know later. But it never hurts to have that basic understanding.
There's one more Facebook that just reminds me of something. So this is called Day 1.0. I think it's by IIT Madras. If you guys can just get it from a friend of yours, or you can just arrange it, it's a very good book. But I think it's, usually used by IIT Madras Consulting Club, but that's a good book that you guys should refer to, which we got to know pretty late. We didn't cover the PEI as much, but this, I think,
Yeah.
don't ignore that part of the interview. Especially I think in McKinsey, my experience was after the first two technical heavy rounds, it was all HR. And what I did was, I think this is something McKinsey also tells you in their workshop. You should have 3 stories in your mind that you want to bring out, and no matter what, you should bring them out, right? So this lady who was taking our workshop, I don't remember her name, but she said that for her it was dance, right? And she said कि मुझसे अगर पूछेंगे कि what is my strength, I'll talk about dance. What is my weakness, I'll talk about dance. So somehow, no matter what the question, I would lead the interviewer to know that I am very, very passionate about dance, right? So just ensure that you have those 3 stories in your mind, and you should also have something which is not on your CV. That's a very, that's something that usually comes up. And okay, fine, I've gone through your CV, but tell me something about yourself which is not on your CV, right? So have at least 2-3 stories in your mind that you want that interviewer to register, and keep that consistent. So I think a trick that worked with me was that, because I had worked on that water project, it was a very good important project for us. I made sure that I talked about that project. If they ask, what's one thing that the most impactful thing that you've done, I would have talked about that project. If they ask what's the entrepreneurship, any activity that you've done which relates to entrepreneurship, I would have talked about that project. Community service, giving back to community, I would have talked about that project. So I would have just made sure that this project comes up somewhere, right? And I keep talking about it. And in fact, I got one of my cases around that project because I spoke about it. So, when these interviewers regroup to discuss your application, there should be something common that all of them remember. I mean, that was something that someone told me later, that all of them remembered that there was something related to water with you, right? So people also increase their chances of getting remembered at the end of the day when they all regroup together to decide on which candidate. That's one thing. And the second thing that I did was, because a lot of these questions, what are your strengths, weaknesses, tell me about yourself, these won't come to you naturally, and these won't even come to you like 10 days before your interview. So what I did was, I had jotted down a list of questions that usually consultants would ask, or a recruiter would ask, in a notebook. And whenever I used to think of a point ki, this could be used as a strength, or this could be something that I want to define, bring up in my interview as my weakness, I used to just note it down. And at the end of, like maybe 1 month ago or 15 days before the interview, I would just make everything into a sentence and then structure things, because by that time I already had a lot of points to cover, because I was maintaining that notebook. Otherwise, for me, HR doesn't come very naturally. Like if you ask me strengths right now, I don't know. Like I'll have to think about it for a while to tell you which strengths I want to bring up in an interview. You can't go there and say my quantitative skills are not good, that's my weakness. You can't do that. But you can also not say I'm a perfectionist and that's my weakness, because then they know if you're faffing, right? I mean, don't come up with like non-genuine and very, very weird weaknesses. Like I'm very hardworking, I take too much on my plate. Those things don't fly well in interviews. People know that you're just over stressing on your strengths to make it a weakness. Be genuine about it. People like genuine people. So yeah, I think that those were the two things that I did for my PEI. But yeah.
I think when you're talking about your weaknesses, like Sanchi is right, don't say you work too much, etc. But also, whatever weakness you're talking about, you should talk about how you're working to address that weakness and what are the steps that you have taken to sort of bridge that gap and make it like your strength. I think we can close this topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, but just to close out, actually, I just want to say it's really important. Don't ignore it, right? Like everyone said, at least I'm sure at the McKinsey, I don't know, I think at BCG, at least, I think there was a lesser maybe emphasis on it, maybe 30%, but at McKinsey, it was easily like 45%, I think 45% of your interviews. Like they really want to know you and they really want to have a conversation with you and they really appreciate it if you're able to talk about things you love in a structured, concise manner. So you'll never be able to do that, as Sanchi said, if you might be, and I envy people who'd be able to do that on the spot, but you need to be so concise because you have only 15 minutes or 10 or 5 minutes to talk about something with this partner, right? You can't take 2.5 minutes of that 5 minutes to think. So just don't ignore this part and prepare for it. Yeah, and be yourself. It's very important.
Thanks for the insights. This was something which only a person who has experienced the procedure and the hustle could have told. Let's see what after consulting. So, what are the opportunities available to a person looking to exit his or her consulting firm?
I'll just pull up we've made a small pen and paper diagram. I think I can start on this one and then you guys can continue. There's lots of paths that are open after consulting. And just to be very clear, like, so I think consulting in itself can be a very draining, tiring job. Like there are a lot of fun things about it and there are a lot of things you learn, but there is a point at which you may or may not want to continue doing consulting for the rest of your life, right? But I do still believe that it's like one of the most invaluable jobs that you can have for the first 2 years of your work life, because of the way it makes you think. And but still, so let's say in 2 years, typically what happens is 2 or 3 years after consulting, people do start evaluating other opportunities that they might want to switch out of because they feel they've gained some skills and they want to do something else. You can also continue in the same path, right? So we'll cover both of those. So in the first part, which is switching out, you could either do at the first level, you could either do higher studies, like you can do public policy for people who are in economics. If you want to do economics or public policy, you have the option to apply to that 2 years after doing McKinsey. Like there are people who have done McKinsey and gone on to Oxford, Cambridge, etc. I would say that someone who wants to go to a place like MIT, which is more thorough on the research front, might need to consider doing a research assistantship. Like I know this because I've spoken to someone who goes there. But if you want to do economics at a place like MIT or one of those colleges, they appreciate research experience that consulting doesn't give you. This is for people who are doing economics, but Oxford, Cambridge, etc. Definitely, I know there are alumni who have done this after 2 years. Apart from that, you have other opportunities like venture capital, private equity, startups, non-profits. We'll deep dive into each of these in a bit, but you can do any four of these, and we'll deep dive into the kinds of roles that you can do at any one of these. People typically what they do is sometimes if they choose to exit after 2 years, they could do any of these roles for another 2 or 3 years. They're often called pre-MBA roles, and after that they move on to apply for an MBA with after they have a total of maybe 3 or 4 years of work experience. Um, and the average work experience of people like of at least some tier 1 MBA schools is 4 years plus. The second bucket is continuing consulting. So either now I maybe Jayashree and Shravya can speak to LEK and BCG, but at McKinsey at least there is something called path to partner right now, which means that if you choose to continue, then you just have to work 1 extra year after your 2 year BA program. You work 1 extra year and then you move into the same associate path as someone who has already done an MBA. So, say you're a business analyst for 3 years, and then you move into the associate track, which then goes on to partner. Like it's the same track that someone who does an MBA from, say, IIMA does. So, they do an MBA, then they become junior associate. Like you're a business analyst, they're a junior associate. They do that for 2 years and then get into associate. You do this for 3 years and then become an associate without doing an MBA. So, that's the path to partner at McKinsey. Um, or you can choose to do consulting for longer than 2 years. Maybe you can do it for 3 to 4 years. I haven't spoken to anybody who has done this personally. So if anyone else, like if any of the three of you have spoken to people, you can shed more light on this. People who choose to do consulting for 4 years, and then because that's generally the average work experience for someone applying for an MBA, then apply for an MBA. So yeah, and if you've done consulting for 4 years, then you would in McKinsey terminology at least, you would be an associate by then. And Shravya and Jayashree can share the equivalent roles. So yeah, this is the very high level picture of what you
As
can
you
do.
laid it out, I just remembered another path. You can
Yeah.
also directly join the industry. So we
Yeah.
also have
Yeah.
other roles in multiple different industries. So that doesn't necessarily have to be a startup. They can be well-established companies where you probably
Corporate
like this,
strategy.
yeah, in corporate strategy, CEO's office, things like that.
Yeah. Correct. So I should add that.
Yeah, I mean, basically, in terms of like, you can directly go after like 3 or 4 years or whatever you think is the, like, depending on your target schools, whenever you want to apply to a B school, you can also go to MBA or like a B school right out of consulting as well. And there are enough amount of profiles where people have gone to HSW, which is Harvard, Stanford, and Wharton schools, the top three schools basically right out of McKinsey, BCG, etc. And like some of the consulting firms also like sponsor your MBA, and I don't know how much it is true for other, but at least at LEK there's a policy that if you want to come back after your B school to LEK, then the LEK can also sponsor your B school or part of tuition and not the whole part. But I mean there is some provisioning like that. Um, so yeah, just wanted to
Yeah,
add that.
just to add to the sixth point, which is whether you want to continue consulting. I think in McKinsey there was this policy that you do 2 years of business analyst program. For the third year, you could have gone to a if you have, let's say, an offer from a B school, right? If you get a return offer from the company, what happens is they sponsor your MBA. And usually, what McKinsey India office does is they can sponsor an MBA equal to the fees of ISB. So let's say currently it's 35 lakhs. They would probably sponsor any of your educational pursuits, right? It could be an MBA outside of India or in India. They would sponsor to the extent of 35 lakhs. And when you come back directly as an associate. So what happens is basically you save years. The rest of the people who get hired from, let's say, after B school, as Ankita mentioned, right? Those would be hired as a junior associate, so they would have to spend 2 years before they become an associate. But McKinsey, if you get a return offer, because they know you've already spent 2 years at the firm as a business analyst, and then you're going for an MBA and then coming back to McKinsey, so they would take you back as an associate. So you save years there. So that's a very good option that a lot of McKinsey BAs take, and then they get an ISB offer. So they go get it fully sponsored by McKinsey and then they come back as an associate. So that's on the continue to consult. Yeah, Ankita.
Yeah, no, yeah, and adding on, at least from McKinsey perspective, in the continuing consulting, there's this thing in McKinsey called mobility that people really enjoy. I mean, now in COVID, it's probably suspended this year, but basically after 2 years, for the third and fourth year, people take this thing called mobility, where if you are good and you apply to offices abroad, you could switch over to the New York office or the Boston office or any office abroad actually. Like there's a whole procedure for that, but that's something that you can do in a post COVID scenario. It's called mobility. And there's also things like MGI. I'm sure this exists at BCG also, with their research arm. I'm not sure what the equivalent is, but MGI is basically the knowledge building arm of McKinsey. It churns out really good reports, and people could also do a 1 or 2 year stint with MGI post doing 2 years of the normal role. Like, I'm just calling this out for maybe economics students who have an interest in things like research and reports, etc.
Right. And I think first and the sixth point we've covered quite a bit. Let me probably talk about venture capital, private equity, and Shravya, and I can probably help you guys hear more because we've made that switch. So I think, like when I was at consulting, I thought I would do consulting for 2 years and then would make a switch. But what happens is essentially these firms, right, VC and PE firms, they would come to you even like as soon as you complete like 8 months into consulting, or maybe like nowadays it's even becoming faster. Even if you complete like 6 7 8 months into 6 months into consulting, they would come to you for an interview. And it just becomes very difficult for you to take that call. At least it was very difficult for me to take that call, whether or not I want to move that quickly to a world which is completely different from consulting, right? So I would probably be, I would have that, make that submission in front of all of you, that I didn't know the difference between a venture capital or a private equity or a growth fund till the time these companies started reaching out to me, right? Because I didn't even think about an exit because I was only like 6 7 months into the firm, etc. So just to make it clear, venture capital are companies that invest in smaller, I mean, new age startups. These startups would be like 2 years old, or not even maybe 2 years old. It could also be like a 6 month old startup where they're raising their seed round or a series A round, etc. So venture capital are those kind of companies, and private equity, basically these are the firms that invest in, I would say, established companies that have a growth history, that have a proven business model, and there is less risk of your investments going bad technically, unless you've committed something which is a blunder, right? So those are the two ends, extreme ends, and growth funds come somewhere in between, which are essentially capital given to a company which propels them towards propels them towards an IPO, or helps them grow their particular business model, right? Or pivot their business model into something else. So those are the three types of exits that people do into the investing career. uh, these jobs are pretty different, but if you are in, let's say, McKinsey, BCG, Bain, LEK, AT Kearney, and Parthenon, you generally have opportunity to interview in these kind of firms, because they're looking for consultants that come from a very, very good background. And they're looking for majority of your quantitative, I mean, they would basically harness your quantitative skills and your page making skills. I mean, that's what they're worried about. How quickly can you solve a problem, how quickly can you analyze a business, etc. These are great opportunities, especially from a B school perspective, but also please evaluate before you make that decision whether or not you really want to do this kind of a job, right? These are like, I would say, on an average, my work hours would be somewhere between 18 to 20 hours on an average. I would say my weekends, my like holidays, festive holidays, etc., they just don't matter, right? So these jobs are starkly different from consulting jobs. Consulting jobs would involve teamwork, would involve a lot of discussions, would involve a lot of humane aspects of things. This is more like working in silos, you doing the analysis yourself, having much higher ownership of the numbers that you present, and also having less, I would say more exposure to the senior management. You're directly working with a VP, or you're directly working with a partner, because the teams are pretty small. Consulting teams for me were like 10 people, 10-member team all the time, because I was mostly on an ops or an implementation piece in McKinsey. But here the entire team size is 10. including the VP, associates, partners. So it's a starkly different job. Uh, but yeah, a lot of people would love to go for it. Like it pays you a lot, but it also takes away a lot of things from you. So keep that in mind before making that switch is one thing that I would say. But yeah, Shravya, Ankita, Jayashree, why did you guys? I mean, Ankita and Jayashree should definitely highlight why did they not make that call. And yeah, Shravya can maybe talk about why did she finally get into investing.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't have anything useful, I think more useful from a second year point of view, in the sense that, but if you are looking for an exit to a VC or a private equity fund, I think VC hires from a lot of startups, people who have startup experience and people who have consulting experience. Not so much IB, but there's a fair amount of people who have also moved from IB to VC, but the proportion is lesser. If you're looking to move to private equity, then consulting is a great way to sort of jump into that role. I don't think any private equity funds hires right out of college. So consulting is a great way to make that switch. Also investment banking. I would say like 60-40 would be the split. 60% consultants in a top global fund and like 40% investment bankers. But that's like a very, very broad generalization. So take it with a pinch of salt. But yeah, I mean, your first path out of college should be to consulting or into areas if you do want to make the move eventually to a private equity fund or VC.
Hmm. Okay, I can speak to non-profit or startup. So I'm basically joining an edtech non-profit startup, which happens to be a fun intersection of everything I want. But the point is that, yeah, so I think a lot of startups also, so like, yeah, startups slash industry hire people who do consulting for things like founder's office or being EA to the founder, etc. So these are people who work directly with startup founders or their teams to help to do two things, right? Again, strategy plus implementation for these companies, like being their right hand basically, to know like everything about that sector, etc. So if you want to switch out, like if you think uh like I mean, I'm sure you guys know the startups that exist, like, like startups like Yulu or Unacademy or Camp K12, etc., etc. All of these places hire people in the founder's office. A lot of edtech, agri-tech startups do that. Those are really fun jobs, and they value consulting skills for those jobs. I would say people who want to do, even though mine is a slightly different role, like because it's an edtech nonprofit, the role is like pretty different. But basically, I think consulting gives you access to some networks that are really nice. Like, I mean, people who are doing really good work, who are also really hardworking, like it gives you access to those kinds of people because, and then those often end up becoming jobs, right? Like, it's not very, like, there are no straightforward paths sort of in the real world. Like, so I would say that because it's a little non-conventional, venture capital and private equity are the most conventional, very hard to get, but also the most conventional switches that consultants make if they choose to switch out. But you can do other things as well. And I think that McKinsey at least, and I'm sure other firms also, give you the opportunity to find the people who will help you find the right job that you want to do after it. So that's one thing. Also, if you want to do like hardcore non-profit, like if you want to join things like Pratham, etc., there are lots of people who join the strategy teams of places like Pratham. So a lot of, at least 2-3 people I know have done that. So if you're people who want to get back into non-profit, to be very honest, you won't be doing any of that at McKinsey. I got really lucky. I did a fun 2-month project on a diversity and inclusion project that I really very much enjoyed. But that was the extent. That was like an MGI type of study. That was the extent of the non-profit or public sector kind of work that I'd wanted to do. So I didn't get to do any of that, but I still have the opportunity to switch out and get back into that space for another 2 years if I want to. So that's always an option that stays open if you do McKinsey for the first 2 years, or any of LEK. I think even LEK, BCG, etc. You can do that and then switch out for another 2 years to non-profit. Um, and industry is things like Abbott and other really large. Abbott is one because like we're familiar with that because that the CEO's office role exists and keeps like getting circulated. But a lot of CEOs or MDs want people from consulting backgrounds to be their sort of right hand, like know everything about the industry, basically be a part of their strategy direction team, basically. So those are the different types of roles broadly that exist.
Yeah, but yeah, I think that's a very comprehensive chart that Ankita has created. I think, but long short, I think the thing is that consulting is one of the best jobs that gives you one of the best exits that you want. So, apart from these six, seven things that are mentioned on the paper, I would say there could be 10 other things that you guys can think of doing. And if if you're a consultant and if you have that background, it just makes it very easy for you to make that switch versus anyone else who is, let's say, even like I've seen my friends in IB struggle to make that switch. When Shravya mentioned 60% consultants, 40% IB, that's a good generalization, but I think very, very firm dependent. So, like for example, my firm at Westbridge, I mean, we don't hire IB people, right? So then it becomes very difficult for any IB person to come to a private equity or a VC job if that person is looking at uh, someone like a Westbridge Capital. So I'm saying consulting is one thing that gives you the switch you want. There could be million other paths, but yeah, I mean, so it's the best start to your career in the end.
Just quickly coming in, I have a hard stop at 4:30, so I will have to drop off. But all of you on this, you can feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any further questions. And this was fun. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Jay.
Hi, Jayashree.
Thank you very much.
Similarly, even I have a hard stop, so I'll also go. But like Jayashree said, please feel free to reach out to me directly in case you have any question. I hope you found this useful. It was nice meeting you all. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Bye, Shravya.
So, consulting after SRCC can be a stepping stone for our future aspirations, and it also opens doors to a wider range of opportunities. Well, with this, we have come to the last part of the session, that is the Q&A round. So, any questions from the audience?
It can be stupid also.
Yeah,
We
please
didn't know
like
what consulting
use
was.
this opportunity to ask whatever questions you have, because I mean, I wish we had this opportunity. Great job, guys, for organizing all.
How do we survive a 12 to 14-hour daily work week? I think that's just I honestly think it's a mental switch you kind of need to make because it's going to happen. Uh, I think from the long term perspective, just the belief that you're learning a lot, there'll be a point at which you're like, I'm not really learning anything. And that's when you'll switch out of consulting. But it's kind of I think it's worth reaching that point. I think all of us did, but it's worth reaching it, right? Like it's worth doing it for like 1.5 years or 2 years and then figuring out that you don't want to learn any more of consulting or you've learned everything. But it's a bit of a mental switch that you have to make. Like there's no other way to do it,
And I
is my
think
sense.
weekends are quite
Yeah.
sacred in consulting.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no one will take your Saturday, Sunday. So you just need to work really hard 5 days of the week. When COVID stops, I'm guessing they might start flybacks again. So I could list out all the perks that they give you to make your 12 to 14 hours seem a little bearable. Like you go to team lunches, you can stay at hotels, you can fly back to whichever city in India you want to fly back on the weekends. Just a lot of like really good people you work with. I think your team and your managers tend to be really good most of the time. So really high quality people environment, but mostly just a mental switch. I think that should take that question.
if you don't get placed
Then there is, yeah, you
consultant
can
from
take that.
SR, how can we go ahead with consulting as a career? Hmm.
I can think of a few things actually. So one is that there are people who do CA. So I think people who do CA, they at least people who are CA rank holders, then laterally can join consulting. Then there are people who in general laterally join consulting also. I think post I don't know too many of those though, but I know people like this person in our batch. She was at Uber for 3 years. So she was doing strategy at Uber, and then she switched to consulting. So you can, if you're in a high growth, well established startup type of a company, I think then you can laterally move. Sometimes people join via McKinsey Knowledge Center. So McKinsey Knowledge Center is the research arm of McKinsey. So you don't work on client facing roles, but you work on specializing in a particular research area. So I knew a person, even though he was someone post MBA, he had joined the McKinsey Knowledge Center as a uh, in the finance research area, and then he did so many projects in the finance practice at McKinsey that it takes a longer time to progress along the path if you do that. But he joined there, and then after 3 or 5 years he switched into a junior associate at McKinsey, so the client facing role. So I would say these three, and I think that people who also do banking probably could apply laterally, right? Who do IB, even though I don't know too many of them, I think it's possible.
Yeah, rarely, but yeah, makes sense.
MTK Research Center line. Just one last thing. Even if you get placed at Bain BCC, Bain Capable BCC, you can also do that. Won't again be client facing, but you can do that and then become an associate at Bain. So I know a lot of people who have done that. So that's another route to getting placed at BB. Okay, we'll take the next one by Shreya. Someone who's had their first experience with consulting at this session. I would suggest start off with Victor Cheng videos. They're super engaging and explanatory. So he has about 3-4 videos on YouTube. You can start with Victor Cheng. I'll just put the name in the chat. Learn all his frameworks, like understand and learn them. Then you can move on to the books, and then you can make a case study group with another friend who might be interested in solving cases and do it with them.
Hmm.
It's totally okay if this is the first time you've engaged with consulting. Very normal for all of us, actually.
Yeah,
Really, we watched Victor Cheng in May or June of the year before
June.
placement, so you're pretty early, so don't stress.
Mhm.
What were your expectations before joining, and also can you shed some light on expectation versus reality? This is a fabulous question. Your actually, so the thing is that nobody knew what consulting was, so I think nobody knew what to expect, very very honestly. Like nobody knew what to expect, but they expected something magical and fun and exciting. So I think that I think that the expectation is sort of met. In terms of people, it's definitely met. You're going to work with really smart people, really fun, outgoing, smart, enjoyable people. So the people I would say is 100 on 100 expectation wise. Um, in terms of the actual work, I think we have actually given you a primer on the kind of work you'll have to do, right? Like I never knew that there's also implementation and operations, etc. So you have to be grounded to the reality that you're not always going to be doing path breaking work. In fact, a lot of times you may not even enjoy the work you're going to do, like very, very honestly. But I think not everybody likes their job 100%, right? Like everybody has like that 30-40% of their job that they don't enjoy, just being very realistic about it. So I think that there's a phase where everyone is feels like they're saturated with consulting after 1.5-2 years and they want to leave. But I genuinely think it's worth it, because I think that it just gives you, just very very honestly speaking, it gives you a brand that you don't understand when you're in college. Like I never realized it, right? Like this just happened. But you do realize that when you say that you're from McKinsey, for example, it'll give you an open path to have a conversation with anybody. Like if you want to join this like startup, if you want to work with the CEO of a startup and you connect with him on LinkedIn and that you say that you're from McKinsey, he will more often than not give you his email ID, and he may not do that for everyone. So consulting is a very hyped job. It doesn't always meet the expectation, right? You won't always enjoy the work you're doing, but it does guarantee you great people, good networks, and a really good exit opportunity to do whatever you want after it. So you can always pick up the skill set and then leave. And after maybe 2+ years, after you feel like you've picked up what there is to be learned. So you can't expect that you will love every part of it. But I still think the pay is great, the people are great, and the experience is pretty great for your first job out of college. Even though you might not sometimes enjoy exactly the work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis sometimes.
Yeah, but there's no other job after college that will give you the kind of exposure consulting gives you. Like you sit in the same room as the CEO and sometimes maybe even get to present one or two slides. So I don't think any job right after college would give you that
Yeah.
exposure. You get to meet the head of the organizations, discuss your ideas with them, co-create and problem solve with them. So I think it also teaches you a lot of ways in which people at that level think, right? So it improves you a lot as a person. I think consulting is something that
Yeah.
all of us are grateful
I
for.
think you're right. I mean, yeah, like I don't think so. Like, for example, once I was just sitting with the DMD of this like public sector bank, right? This is the person who's level 2 of the bank, and he knows my name and he's having a conversation with me about their strategy on like a particular topic. There is no way on earth that conversation would have
Exactly.
happened. I think at like when I'm 22 years old, it wouldn't have happened, 21 or 22, right? And he's taking me very seriously because I have all the numbers that he needs to have that conversation with me. So yeah, just from that, yeah, she's absolutely right. Like from an exposure perspective, um super fun when you're 21, 22 to have that kind of exposure. Yeah. And basically, it's like what we said, right? The ownership bit. Everyone expects that you will own your answer. So after the first 6 months of a bit of hand holding, they expect that you will know the answer, that you will be able to talk to all the clients, that with their help, they will give you the authority to present your answer also, be it to the partner, senior partner, senior client, CEO, etc. Obviously, depending on context, but yeah, like that part's really fun. Like nobody can ever steal your work from you at least at McKinsey. Like nobody will take credit for what you've done, or like, and you will always get the opportunity to be the one presenting your work in a McKinsey context at least, and that's very
Very
fun.
valuable. And like 21-year-old straight out of college, you will get that your opinions will start getting valued, right? So there's something called intellectual non-hierarchy that we used to say exists in McKinsey, where even if that person is a partner versus someone who's a just new recent joinee analyst, they can have this different opinions and both the opinions would be considered. And I don't think there's any other job that gives you that. In fact, the job that I'm currently in, that's maybe much more like right after I have 2 years of consulting experience and then I have made this switch, right? So I have much more experience than what I had when I was in college. But on a ground level, if I were to think about where is my opinion valued more, it would always be consulting, right? So just that job is something that you should, I mean, we don't realize how good it is. But yeah, just
Mm.
awesome.
I I think we don't have any more questions. Okay. So, well, on behalf of all the attendees, I would like to thank you for sharing your experiences with us. Your insights will definitely help us a lot for defining our future goals and achieving them. Thank you very much.
I hope, guys.
Yeah.
And feel free to reach out personally to either of us,
Same
all
here.
four of
Yeah,
us.
all four of us.
And thanks for organizing this, Shashwat. I think would be very helpful, I'm sure.